Welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
Yes,
Yeah.
welcome. We have a really incredible episode lined up for you today.
We absolutely do. And we are setting out on a very specific mission for this episode. We are going to completely transform the way you handle every single conflict, disagreement, and deal in your life.
It's a big promise, but we mean it.
Yeah, we really do. We are talking about the mechanics of human agreement today, and we are getting our roadmap from this book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, by William L. Ury and Roger Fisher.
Such a landmark book. I mean, it's really the gold standard.
Exactly. And whether you are, asking for a raise or buying a house or just trying to decide where to eat dinner tonight with your spouse, the principles we are exploring today are going to change your approach from the ground up.
It really is a fundamental shift in how we interact as a society. Because if you look back just a generation ago, the world essentially ran on strict hierarchies.
Pyramids of power, basically.
Right. Pyramids of power. The people at the top, whether you were looking at a multinational corporation or the political arena or even just the traditional family structure, they were positioned to make the decisions and hand down the orders.
And everyone else just had to fall in line.
Exactly. The people at the bottom were expected to just follow them without question. But today, you and I live in a completely different reality. We're in the middle of this massive, quiet negotiation revolution.
Yeah, the old structures just don't work anymore.
They don't. Those old, rigid pyramids have shattered. They've shifted into dynamic, horizontal networks of negotiation. We have flatter organizations, much faster innovation cycles, unprecedented global connectivity.
Which means you can't just boss people around.
You really can't.
Yeah.
What that practically means is that we have to rely on dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of individuals over whom we exercise absolutely no direct control. You cannot simply bark orders anymore and expect compliance.
You have to talk to them.
Yes. To get what you want, you are compelled to negotiate. What's fascinating here is that we are all negotiators, whether we realize it or not. Every single day, you are engaging in this process, even if you never step foot in a corporate boardroom.
That is exactly the shift we are talking about. We are all negotiating constantly, even when we don't consciously label it as such. And it reminds me of this beautiful, incredibly high-stakes quote from the poet Wallace Stevens that is featured early in this book.
Oh, I love this quote.
It's so good. He wrote, "After the final no, there comes a yes and on that yes, the future world depends."
It gives you chills, doesn't it?
It really perfectly encapsulates the gravity of what we are dealing with. But before we get to that world-building yes, we have to talk about the core problem most of us face, which is how we currently try to get there.
Right, because our current methods are usually pretty terrible.
Yeah, we are stuck in this exhausting rut of what this book calls positional bargaining. Okay, let's unpack this. The text gives a fantastic, highly relatable story of being in a dusty, eclectic antique shop.
We've all been in that shop.
Right. So you spot a brass dish. It's beautiful, but it's clearly dented. You bring it to the shopkeeper. You ask the price. The shopkeeper puffs up a bit and says, "That is a beautiful antique. I could let it go for $75.
The classic high anchor.
Exactly. So you counter with a lowball. You say, "Oh, come on. It's dented. I'll give you $15. The shopkeeper acts deeply offended. "Really? I might consider a serious offer, but $15 certainly isn't serious."
And the dance begins.
Yeah, the dance. You reply, trying to sound firm, "Well, I could go to $20, but I would never pay anything like $75. Quote me a realistic price." The shopkeeper narrows their eyes, playing the game. "You drive a hard bargain, young lady. $60 cash right now."
They come down a tiny bit.
Right, and you shoot back $25. The shopkeeper sighs, goes to $37.50, and declares at the absolute lowest they will go. It is a classic haggling minuet. We've all been there.
We absolutely have. And it is the default human setting for conflict resolution, but it is terribly flawed. What is actually happening in that antique shop is the pure essence of positional bargaining.
It's just a tug of war.
It is. Each side takes a rigid, somewhat arbitrary position, argues fiercely for it, and then slowly makes small, painful concessions to try and reach some sort of middle ground compromise.
And it feels terrible for everyone involved.
It does. In this dynamic, you generally see people fall into one of two extremes. First, you have the hard bargainer. For them, the negotiation is purely a contest of wills. Their singular goal is victory.
They just want to crush you.
Yes. They demand concessions as a condition of maintaining the relationship. They dig their heels into their position, they make threats, and they try to win by simply being more stubborn and aggressive than the person across the table.
And then there's the opposite.
Right. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the soft bargainer. Their primary goal is agreement at almost any cost. They want to avoid personal conflict, so they make concessions readily, they trust the other side implicitly, and they yield to pressure just to keep the peace and be liked.
Now, if you play the soft game against a hard bargainer...
You're going to get absolutely fleeced.
Right. But what's really interesting is that even if two soft bargainers meet, it doesn't guarantee a good outcome either. It's not just about protecting yourself from bullies. This book illustrates the fatal flaw of soft bargaining perfectly, using that classic O. Henry short story, The Gift of the Magi.
Such a heartbreaking story.
It is. You know the one, the impoverished young couple trying desperately to buy meaningful Christmas gifts for each other? The wife, Della, has gorgeous long hair, and the husband, Jim, has a prized heirloom pocket watch.
And they both decide to be incredibly selfless.
Yes, but to a fault. Because Della is a soft bargainer with her husband's happiness, she prioritizes the relationship above her own assets. She cuts off and sells her hair to buy him a handsome platinum chain for his watch.
And Jim does the exact same thing.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Jim, operating on the exact same soft bargaining principle of sacrificing his own interests for the relationship, sells his prized watch to buy her beautiful, expensive tortoiseshell combs for her hair.
It's tragic.
They both wanted to be incredibly generous. They both yielded their own interests completely to please the other, and they ended up with a sloppy, tragic agreement where neither got what they actually needed. He has a chain for a watch he no longer owns, and she has combs for hair she no longer has.
It's a beautiful literary story, but as a negotiation strategy, it's a total disaster. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows us that negotiation is actually a two-level game.
Okay, a two-level game. Explain that.
Well, there is the metagame. Every negotiation involves the substance, like the price of the brass dish or the selection of the Christmas presents, and it involves the procedure, which is how you choose to negotiate that substance.
The rules of engagement.
Yes. Are you going to play the hard game? Are you going to play the soft game? Are you going to haggle over positions? The brilliant solution presented in this book is to refuse to play either game.
Yeah.
You change the game entirely to something called principled negotiation.
Principled negotiation.
Exactly. The core ethos of principled negotiation is to be hard on the merits of the problem, but soft on the people involved. You completely bypass the haggling over superficial positions and focus instead on underlying interests, mutual gains, and objective standards.
Which is a fantastic theoretical pivot. And it brings us to the first major principle of this approach. Separate the people from the problem.
It sounds so simple, right?
It sounds like common sense, but let's be honest. In the heat of an argument, when your adrenaline is spiking, it is incredibly difficult to do. We immediately forget who we are dealing with, and we conflate the issue with the individual.
We do, because we forget the psychological reality that negotiators are human beings first. We are not abstract, rational representatives of a corporation, a country, or a household. We are flesh and blood.
We get emotional.
Very. We have fragile egos, deep-seated cognitive biases, massive blind spots, and wildly unpredictable emotions. When you are negotiating, this human aspect can either be incredibly helpful, allowing you to build deep trust, rapport, and respect over time, or it can be utterly disastrous.
And positional bargaining usually leads to the disastrous side.
Yes, because the danger of positional bargaining is that our egos become hopelessly entangled with the substance of the problem. If I attack your position on the budget, your brain doesn't process it as a math problem. Your brain registers it as a personal attack on you.
The walls go up instantly.
Instantly. You get defensive, you stop listening to my logic and start preparing your counterattack.
The book uses a fantastic analogy to reframe how we should approach this psychological trap. Picture two shipwrecked sailors in a tiny lifeboat, adrift in the middle of a vast, unforgiving ocean.
A very stressful situation.
Totally. They have very limited rations. If they start arguing over those rations by sitting face-to-face at opposite ends of the boat, pointing fingers and attacking each other, blaming each other for the shipwreck, accusing each other of being greedy, questioning each other's character, what happens?
They end up fighting and flipping the boat.
Exactly. They will tip the boat and they will sink. They both drown. The only way they survive is if they figuratively and perhaps literally sit side by side on the same bench, look out at the ocean together, and attack the problem.
And the problem is survival.
Yes. The problem is survival. They need to figure out a system for catching rainwater, rationing the meager food they have, and keeping watch for rescue planes. When you successfully separate the people from the problem, you realize the person sitting across the boardroom table or the kitchen table is not the enemy. The unresolved issue is the enemy.
That requires a massive conscious shift in perspective. And to navigate this shift successfully, you have to manage perception. Because in many ways, perception is the problem.
Perception is reality, as they say.
It really is. The conflict doesn't exist objectively in the world. It exists entirely in the different ways the two parties perceive the world. You have to understand, empathetically, the immense tower of their point of view. It is not enough to study them objectively like a beetle under a microscope. You have to truly know what it feels like to be the beetle. You have to understand their fears and their logic.
And we are notoriously bad at this because of how human cognition is wired. We constantly project our own anxieties onto other people. There is a story in this book, the New York Times bar story, that perfectly highlights this flaw in our perception.
Oh, this is a great example.
So a man and a woman meet in a bar, they hit it off, have a few drinks, and he offers her a ride home. She accepts. He tells her he knows a great shortcut, but instead of taking the main roads, he starts driving down all these unfamiliar, winding, pitch-black streets.
Red flags going up everywhere.
Everywhere. He's driving incredibly fast, taking sharp turns. In the passenger seat, the tension is building. She is gripping the door handle. Her heart is pounding. She is terrified. But the punchline of the story is, he got her home so fast, she caught the beginning of the 10 o'clock news.
He was just trying to be helpful.
Exactly. The reason that ending is surprising to the reader is that we immediately deduce the worst possible intentions from our own fears. We assumed he was a predator because driving fast down dark alleys triggers our danger response. In negotiations, we do this constantly. We assume that whatever we fear is exactly what the other side actively intends to do.
And that assumption is a relationship killer. This is exactly why you must make your proposals consistent with their values. It's an act of face-saving. It's not about being weak. It's about being effective.
How does that work in practice?
Let's look at the law of the sea negotiations from the 1970s and 80s regarding deep seabed mining. And just to set the ground rules for you as we discuss these historical examples from the book, we are explicitly stating that we are looking at this purely through the lens of negotiation strategy.
Absolutely. Putting all heavy geopolitics aside, we are strictly analyzing the mechanics of the agreement here, not taking any political sides whatsoever.
Precisely. So, in these negotiations, representatives from developing nations wanted the highly industrialized nations to transfer their advanced deep-sea mining technology to them. The industrialized nations were understandably hesitant. They had spent billions developing this tech.
They didn't just want to give it away.
Right. Now, if the developing nations had just aggressively demanded the technology, publicly stating that the rich countries were greedy and hoarding it, the industrialized nations would have felt attacked. Their perception of the developing nations as hostile would be confirmed, and they would have flatly refused.
Because that attacks their ego and their values.
Exactly. Instead, the proposal was carefully framed around joint participation and mutual benefit. It aligned with the industrialized nations' own stated values of fair enterprise, global development, and international cooperation.
It changed the narrative.
Yes. The developing nations didn't just demand a handout. They constructed a scenario where sharing the technology was the right, honorable, and structurally sound thing to do for the global economy. They saved face for the industrialized nations, making it easy for them to say yes without feeling like they were capitulating to a threat.
That is such a vital distinction. But even with perfect framing, these conversations involve managing the raw emotion that inevitably comes up. We aren't robots. People get angry, they get scared, they get insulted. How do you separate the people from the problem when someone is across the table, red in the face, screaming at you?
It starts with understanding where that emotion is coming from. Emotions in these high-stakes scenarios aren't just random, irrational outbursts. They are almost always driven by 5 core concerns.
Core concerns.
These are universal human drivers, regardless of culture or context. First is autonomy, the primal desire to make your own choices and control your own fate. Second is appreciation, the deep desire to be recognized, understood, and valued for your perspective.
Everyone wants to feel appreciated.
Absolutely. Third is affiliation, the desire to belong to a peer group and feel connected. Fourth is role, the desire to have a meaningful, respected purpose in the interaction. And fifth is status, the desire to feel fairly seen and acknowledged in relation to others.
So when people explode, it's usually because one of those is threatened.
Yes, when you unconsciously trample on these core concerns during a negotiation, maybe you talk down to someone threatening their status, or you make a unilateral decision threatening their autonomy, you ignite explosive negative emotions. Conversely, when you actively attend to them, you build immense resilient rapport.
And when those emotions do boil over, despite your best efforts, how do you handle it? I found the historical example of the 1950s Steel Industry Human Relations Committee absolutely brilliant.
A fascinating case study.
They were dealing with incredibly volatile labor management conflicts. I mean, the tension was palpable, strikes were looming, livelihoods were on the line. And just as a reminder, explicitly stating for our listeners, we are not taking sides between management and unions here. We are solely analyzing the brilliant procedural mechanics this committee used to manage human emotion.
Right, maintaining neutrality on the politics.
Exactly. So they instituted a simple, almost shockingly basic procedural rule for their meetings. Only one person can get angry at a time.
It's brilliant.
It is such a genius move. It legitimized the human need to let off steam. If a union rep started yelling and venting his frustrations, it was okay. It was his turn to be angry. The management didn't have to yell back defensively. They could just sit there and let him vent, knowing their turn would come if they needed it.
It creates a pressure release valve.
Yes, it completely prevents that deadly, escalating spiral of action and furious counteraction that destroys relationships.
And that rule enforces the ultimate tool for managing emotion, which is active listening. When you listen actively, you aren't just politely waiting for your turn to speak so you can launch your rebuttal. You are striving to truly, deeply comprehend their reality.
Let me ask you, the listener, directly. What stands out to you when you feel truly heard by someone? Think about a time when you were deeply upset or frustrated, and the person you were talking to didn't try to immediately fix it, they didn't argue with your logic, and they didn't tell you to calm down.
Telling someone to calm down never works.
Yeah, never. But what if they just looked you in the eye, gave you their full attention, and said, I completely understand why you feel that way. That makes total sense. The tension just physically leaves your body, doesn't it? You can almost feel your shoulders drop.
It does, because making the other side feel genuinely understood is one of the cheapest and most incredibly effective concessions you can possibly make in any negotiation.
It doesn't cost a dime.
It costs you absolutely nothing to say, I see your point, or I understand why this is so frustrating for you. But it fulfills their core concern for appreciation and status. Once they feel heard and validated, their neurological threat response dials down.
They feel safe.
Yes, they can relax. They no longer feel the need to aggressively defend their position because you've acknowledged it. And that perfectly sets the stage for the second major principle of the book. Focus on interests, not positions.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We spend so much of our lives fighting over positions, which are just the surface level demands. I want a $10,000 raise. I won't pay more than $300,000 for this house. Those are positions.
Exactly, the rigid demands.
But we completely ignore the interests, which are the underlying fears, needs, desires, and motivations that actually drive those surface demands. There is a classic story from the organizational theorist Mary Parker Follett about two men arguing in a library reading room.
A great illustration of this.
One man wants the window open, the other man wants the window closed. They're bickering back and forth, disturbing everyone. Open it a crack. No, open it halfway. No, it must be closed completely. They're completely deadlocked on their incompatible positions.
Neither will budge.
Right. So the librarian walks in to resolve the dispute. She asks the first man why he wants the window open. He says, to get some fresh air. It's stuffy in here. She then asks the second man why he wants it closed. He says, to avoid the draft, I'm getting a chill.
So she uncovers the interests.
Exactly. These are their core interests. The positions are open versus closed. The interests are fresh air versus avoiding a draft. The librarian thinks for a second, then leaves the reading room, goes into the next room, and opens a window wide.
Problem solved.
This brilliant move brings in the fresh air the first man wanted, without creating the draft the second man feared. Both interests are perfectly met because she completely ignored their stated positions and looked at the underlying needs.
That is a brilliant micro-example of everyday conflict. But the true power of this framework is that it scales up to the highest, most complex levels of global diplomacy. Let's break down the 1978 Camp David summit between Egypt and Israel.
A huge historical moment.
It was. And once more, to ensure complete clarity for our audience, we are neutrally reporting the book's historical example here to study the mechanics of negotiation. without taking any political sides whatsoever.
Absolutely. Strictly neutral analysis here.
At that historic summit, the stated positions of the two nations were completely, utterly incompatible. Israel had occupied the Sinai Peninsula since the Six-Day War in 1967 and insisted on keeping some of it for strategic depth. Egypt insisted that every single inch of the Sinai must be returned to Egyptian sovereignty.
There was zero overlap.
None. There was zero overlap in their positions. If they had engaged in traditional positional bargaining, they would have pulled out a map and tried to draw a line down the middle of the desert, splitting the difference. That would have been entirely unacceptable to both nations, and the summit would have collapsed.
Because you can't compromise on national identity.
Exactly. You cannot split the difference on sovereignty. But when the mediators looked behind the rigid positions, they found very different underlying interests. Israel's primary underlying interest was security. They had been attacked repeatedly, and they did not want Egyptian tanks massed right on their immediate border.
And Egypt's interest.
Egypt's primary underlying interest was sovereignty. The Sinai was their ancestral land, a matter of deep national pride, and they could not accept another nation ruling it. Once those underlying interests were brought to the surface, the solution, while complex to execute, became conceptually clear.
Which was?
Return the entire Sinai to complete Egyptian sovereignty, but mandate that large swaths of it become a demilitarized zone. The Egyptian flag flies over the land, completely satisfying their absolute interest in sovereignty. But no Egyptian tanks or heavy military presence can be stationed near the border, completely satisfying Israel's absolute interest in security.
They bypassed the irreconcilable positions and dovetailed the compatible interests.
Yes. It's an incredible historical achievement.
It really is. But let's bring it back to the listener. How do we uncover these hidden interests in our own lives? Because people usually don't walk into a salary negotiation or a vendor dispute and clearly articulate their deepest views and needs. They just pound their fist and state their position.
You have to become intensely curious. You must utilize the power of asking why and why not. When someone stakes out a firm, seemingly unreasonable position, do not attack the position. Ask them to explain the theory and the need behind it.
Give us an example.
Say you are a landlord and a commercial tenant says, I absolutely must have a 5-year lease. Don't just argue that 3 years is standard. Ask, help me understand why a 5-year lease is so critical to your business model right now.
And they might reveal their interest.
Right. You might find out their investors require a 5-year commitment before releasing the next round of funding. You also ask, why not? To understand their rejection of your ideas. Why not do a 3-year lease with a guaranteed fixed-rate option to renew for 2 more? You are constantly probing, trying to figure out the human needs driving the corporate demands.
And as you are probing these interests, you can utilize a fascinating psychological tool discussed in the text called cognitive dissonance.
Oh, this is a powerful concept.
The psychologist Leon Festinger coined this term. The theory is that the human brain absolutely hates holding 2 contradictory beliefs at the same time. It creates immense psychological tension. You can use this to your advantage. You create a mental conflict for the other person by attacking the problem with absolute ferocity, but being incredibly, almost confusingly supportive of the person. Let's say you are dealing with a vendor who keeps missing deadlines.
A very common issue.
You sit them down and say, listen, I have massive respect for you personally. You are brilliant, your product quality is unmatched, and I genuinely love working with your team. But this current delivery schedule is completely unacceptable. It is destroying our supply chain, and it is going to ruin our profit margins.
You are drawing a hard line on the issue.
Yes, but you create dissonance. The fact that you clearly like and respect them contradicts the fact that you despise their schedule. To overcome this uncomfortable dissonance, they will actually be highly tempted to dissociate themselves from the problem.
They want to fix the tension.
Right. They will want to join your side to fix the schedule just to resolve the psychological tension and maintain that positive relationship you've affirmed.
It is a highly effective, deeply human strategy. And while you are employing these techniques, you must abide by another crucial rule. Look forward, not back.
This is so hard for people to do.
It is. Most arguments, whether in a marriage or a corporate boardroom, are just 2 people exhaustively reacting to what happened yesterday. You didn't file the Q3 report? Well, you didn't give me the accurate sales data. I didn't give you the data because you were late to the meeting.
It's just a blame game.
That is just 2 people gathering evidence to confirm their negative biases about each other. It solves nothing. You have to stop asking people to justify yesterday. Instead, explicitly pivot the conversation and ask them what we should do tomorrow.
Pivot to the future.
Yes. Okay, given that the Q3 report isn't filed and we are both frustrated, how do we structure the workflow so it's absolutely guaranteed to be on the CEO's desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow? You pivot the emotional energy from defensive justification to collaborative problem solving.
I hear what you're saying, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. Focusing on interest and looking to the future is great, but eventually you have to actually come up with a tangible solution. You can't just talk about your feelings and interests forever.
That is entirely true.
Which flows beautifully into the third principle of the book: invent options for mutual gain. Because once you know the interests, you have to actually create the mechanical solutions that satisfy them. And the biggest trap here is something called the fixed pie fallacy.
The enemy of creativity.
It is the cynical assumption that the pie is only so big, and if I get a bigger slice, you must, by mathematical definition, get a smaller one. The book illustrates this with the tragic comedy of the two children fighting over a single orange.
Yeah.
They argue and argue back and forth. I want the orange. No, I want the orange. Finally, they decide to compromise. They take a knife and cut the orange perfectly, equally in half. The first child takes their half, excitedly eats the fruit inside, and throws away the peel.
And the second child?
The second child takes their half, throws away the fruit, and uses the peel to zest a cake they are baking. They compromised perfectly on their positions, and in doing so, they literally threw half the value of the orange in the trash. They left money on the table because they assumed a fixed pie.
That tragedy of the orange happens every single day in massive corporate mergers and in quiet living room negotiations. We fail to invent options because we hit 4 distinct psychological obstacles that crush creativity.
What are they?
First is premature judgment. The moment someone tentatively suggests a new idea, our critical analytical mind pounces on it, looking for flaws and explaining why it won't work. Judgment severely hinders imagination.
We shoot down ideas too fast.
Second is the habit of searching for a single answer. We incorrectly think our job in a negotiation is to immediately narrow the gap between positions, rather than broadening the pool of potential options. Third is that fixed pie assumption you just described perfectly. And fourth is the selfish belief that solving their problem is their problem. We think we only need to worry about our side of the table, and if they're struggling to find value, that's their tough luck.
But the reality is, if you don't solve their problem, they aren't going to sign the agreement, which means your problem doesn't get solved either. So the antidote to these obstacles is dedicated, structured brainstorming. You have to completely separate the act of inventing options from the act of judging them.
Absolutely.
The book gives an incredible example of a manufacturing union and management team struggling with a rash of unauthorized wildcat strikes. Production is halting. Everyone is losing money, tensions are sky high, and just maintaining our strict neutrality, we aren't taking sides on union versus management politics here, just analyzing the process.
Always neutral.
So they decide to hold a dedicated brainstorming session where criticism of any idea is explicitly, strictly banned. Suddenly, because the fear of judgment is removed, wild ideas come out. Someone suggests a joint union management softball team. Someone else suggests a bowling team. Another says, what about an annual summer picnic for all the employees' families?
They're just throwing things at the wall.
Right. Now, are these ideas going to instantly solve complex labor disputes and wage disagreements? Of course not. But by generating these ideas without judgment, they realize a shared underlying interest. They need to establish friendly human relations outside the pressure cooker of the factory floor before they can tackle the hard issues. They successfully expanded the pie of options by removing judgment.
To structure this kind of creative thinking when the stakes are high, this book introduces a framework called the circle chart method. It moves methodically through 4 quadrants. First, you look at the problem in the real world. What are the current tangible symptoms? Second, you move to analysis in theory. You diagnose the underlying causes of those symptoms. Third, you brainstorm approaches. What are some broad theoretical strategies or cures? And fourth, you move back to the real world with action ideas. What specific, concrete steps can be taken tomorrow to implement those approaches?
Can you walk us through how that actually works? Because it sounds a bit abstract.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The book uses a powerful, heavy example from Northern Ireland to demonstrate this. Maintaining strict political neutrality, as we discuss this, the historical problem in the real world, step 1, was the deep, violent division and hostility between Catholic and Protestant communities.
A very real, very painful problem.
Yes. Moving to step 2, the theoretical analysis, One diagnosed cause was that prejudice and sectarian narratives were being passed down intergenerationally from a very young age.
Mm.
Moving to step 3, brainstorming theoretical approaches, one approach generated was that mutual understanding and shared narratives should be promoted in young children before those prejudices could permanently lock in.
So how do they make that actionable?
That's step 4. The concrete action idea that came out of this structured brainstorming was having Catholic and Protestant teachers collaborate to write a common shared history workbook for primary schools. It presented history from different points of view and used empathetic role-playing exercises. They took a massive, seemingly intractable, violent conflict, ran it through the circle chart, and distilled it into a highly actionable, mutually beneficial option: a workbook.
That is the power of what the book calls dovetailing differing interests. We usually think our differences are the exact things that keep us apart, but often differences are exactly the mechanics that create a deal. As the authors write, vive la différence.
It's a great concept.
Think of the old nursery rhyme about Jack's brat. Jack could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean. If they both liked the exact same part of the meat, they would fight bitterly over the food. Because they have vastly different tastes, they can dovetail their interests and lick the platter clean together.
Their differences actually unite them.
Right. In complex negotiations, differences in beliefs, differences in the value placed on time, and differences in forecasts about the future can be dovetailed brilliantly. Take an aging superstar football player negotiating a contract extension with a team owner. They have totally different forecasts. Well, the player is confident he's going to have an MVP season and stay healthy. The owner thinks the player is past his prime, fragile, and likely to get injured. If they just argued over a guaranteed base salary, they'd never agree. But they can dovetail those different forecasts.
Like creating a conditional deal.
Exactly. They agree on a much lower guaranteed base salary, which protects the owner's risk if the player gets hurt. But they add a massive multi-million-dollar performance bonus if the player wins the championship. The player gets the massive upside he believes in, and the owner protects his downside.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your entire goal in this creative phase is to make their decision easy. You want to present them with what the authors call a yesable proposition. You want to draft a proposal that is so perfectly attuned to their interests and so elegantly resolves their problems while meeting your own that all they have to do is simply say the word yes.
You do the work for them.
You aren't asking them to formulate words or negotiate room. You have done the heavy lifting for them. You are just asking them for performance.
Okay, but let's be real for a minute. Even with shared interests, brilliant brainstorming, and beautifully crafted yesable propositions, you will inevitably hit issues where your interests directly, stubbornly conflict. You want to pay less rent, the landlord wants more rent. You want the raw materials delivered tomorrow, the supplier wants to deliver them next week to save on shipping. No amount of brainstorming changes that fundamental mathematical clash.
That is very true.
This brings us to principle 4. Insist on objective criteria.
You are absolutely right, and this is where principled negotiation shows its teeth. When interests directly conflict, if you try to resolve it by pitting your stubborn will against their stubborn will, you are going to destroy the relationship.
It just becomes an ego battle.
It becomes a raw test of who can hold out longer, who is more aggressive, who is more willing to walk away. To escape this destructive battle of wills, you must pivot the conversation to use objective external standards. This means tying the agreement to things outside of either party's control. Market value, legal precedent, scientific merit, professional standards, or replacement costs.
There's a brilliant, highly relatable story in the book about a homeowner negotiating with a contractor over building a house foundation. The contractor wants to build a shallow foundation to save money and time. The homeowner pushes back, concerned about stability.
A classic conflict of interest.
Right. The contractor, realizing he's getting pushback, tries to deflect by offering a sweet deal. He offers to hire the homeowner's brother-in-law for the framing crew as a sort of informal bribe. A soft positional bargainer might take the bribe, avoid the conflict, and give in on the foundation.
But a principled negotiator wouldn't.
Exactly. A principled negotiator insists on objective criteria. The homeowner must look the contractor in the eye and say, I appreciate the offer to hire my brother-in-law, but that has absolutely nothing to do with the structural integrity of this house. Let's look at the objective building codes for this specific seismic zone. Let's look at what the independent structural engineer's blueprints require for soil of this density. You remove the battle of wills entirely and submit to the objective standard.
And beyond just objective standards, you can use fair procedures to resolve conflicting interests. The classic, universally understood example is two children dividing a single piece of cake. One cuts, the other chooses.
Oh, I use that with my kids all the time.
It works perfectly. Neither child can complain about the size of their slice because the procedure itself inherently ensures fairness. The child cutting the cake is highly incentivized to cut it exactly, painstakingly in half, knowing the other child gets the first pick. Now, it's easy to dismiss that as child's play, but this exact mechanical concept scales to massive international levels.
How does it scale?
Let's go back to the law of the sea negotiations, and again, maintaining our strictly neutral analysis of the mechanics here. They had to figure out the exact fee that private mining companies would pay to the international community to mine the deep seabed. The companies obviously wanted the fee as low as possible. The developing nations wanted it as high as possible. It was a brutal standoff.
So how did they resolve it without a fight?
Instead of haggling over numbers, they agreed to utilize an objective MIT computer model to calculate the exact economics and profit margins of deep-sea mining. The model provided an objective fee structure that both sides could accept without feeling like they had backed down to the other's demands.
They deferred to the math.
Yes. Furthermore, they used a sophisticated variation of one cuts, the other chooses for allocating the actual mining sites. A private company would spend millions surveying the ocean floor and present two proposed mining sites to the international governing body, the enterprise.
Okay, so the company finds two sites.
Right. The enterprise would then pick one site to keep for itself and grant the company the license to mine the other. Because the company didn't know which site they would ultimately get, they were forced to make sure both sites were equally promising and lucrative.
It's just elegant system design. Okay, let's walk through a real-life masterclass of using objective criteria from the book. Tom Griffith had his parked car completely destroyed by a rogue city dump truck. The insurance adjuster calls Tom and offers $15,000, flatly claiming it's company policy.
A very standard insurance tactic.
Totally. Now, Tom doesn't yell, he doesn't curse, he doesn't counter with $20,000. He calmly asks for the theory behind the number. How did you arrive at $15,000? The adjuster just keeps stonewalling, repeating, that's what the company decided. Take it or leave it. That's the offer.
Trying to force a battle of wills.
Exactly. But Tom says, look, $15,000 might be entirely fair. I honestly don't know, but I need to understand objectively why I'm entitled to that specific amount. Let's look at what a comparable car, same year, same mileage, costs on the open market. Tom absolutely refuses to accept arbitrary numbers. He demands the objective standard.
And he wins.
He does. He eventually does his own research, brings in newspaper ads for similar cars showing they sell for much more, and forces the adjuster to base the payout on the objective replacement cost. He completely neutralized the massive insurance company's pressure tactics just by asking for the principal.
Tom Griffith beautifully demonstrated the three critical rules of negotiating with objective criteria. First, frame each issue as a joint search for criteria. Act like a judge looking for the right precedent, not a debater trying to win an argument. Let's figure out what's fair together.
Collaboration, not combat.
Yes. Second, reason and be open to reason. If the insurance adjuster had brought in objective, verifiable data showing the car was indeed only worth $15,000, Tom would have had to accept it. You must yield to principle, not to pressure. And third, never yield to pressure. Whether the pressure takes the form of a bribe, a threat, a manipulative appeal to trust, or simply a stubborn refusal to budge, you calmly invite them to state their reasoning, and you refuse to move a single inch until they provide an objective basis for their position.
So what does this all mean for the real world? Because it all sounds great in theory, being calm, looking for objective standards, brainstorming. But we all know those situations where the other side is just massive, mean, and holds all the cards. What if you are the little guy facing down a giant? This takes us to the next vital phase, the yes buts, dealing with power and refusals.
It's the most common anxiety people have with this book. When dealing with a significantly more powerful opponent, the biggest mistake people make is setting a bottom line.
Which people think is a good thing to have.
They do, but a bottom line is a rigid, worst acceptable outcome you decide on in your head before the negotiation even starts. I will not accept a penny less than $50,000 for this house, and if they offer $39,000, I'm walking. The problem is, a bottom line severely limits your ability to benefit from what you might learn during the negotiation.
You box yourself in.
Right. Maybe you learn the buyer will pay $49,000, but also cover all closing costs and waive the inspection, which is actually a better deal. But your rigid bottom line blinds you to it. Instead of a bottom line, you need to develop your BATNA.
Ah, the bait TNA.
Yes. your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Your BTNA is the objective standard against which any proposed agreement should be measured. It is exactly what you will do if you walk away from the table without a deal.
I love the story of the small town and the massive factory that illustrates this perfectly. A small town wanted to raise the local factory's goodwill tax payment from $300,000 a year to $2.3 million a year. The factory executives basically laughed at the town council. They had all the money, all the corporate lawyers, all the economic clout in the region.
A total David and Goliath situation.
The town felt completely powerless until the town diligently developed a strong BTNA. They looked objectively at their alternatives if no agreement was reached. They realized they had immense municipal power they hadn't considered. They could require strict new building codes for the factory's planned expansion. They could strictly enforce long-ignored environmental regulations. They could impose rigid daily water usage limits on the factory's cooling systems.
They found their leverage.
Once the town developed this powerful, realistic BTNA, their entire posture changed. They didn't have to yell, they didn't have to threaten, they didn't have to beg. They just sat down at the table, secure in the quiet knowledge of what would legally happen if they walked away. They calmly explained their alternatives. They got their $2.3 million.
Because the relative negotiating power isn't determined by who has the most wealth or the biggest size. It is determined entirely by who has the best walkaway alternative. If your BTNA is strong, you are powerful. If your BTNA is weak, you are vulnerable, no matter how rich you are.
That makes perfect sense.
But what if the other side simply won't play the principled game? What if you're sitting there trying to talk about underlying interests and objective criteria, and they just keep screaming their rigid positions at you, refusing to engage in logic? This is where you have to use a technique the authors call negotiation jujitsu.
Oh, this is a fascinating concept. Break this down for us.
Think about physical jujitsu. If a larger, heavier opponent rushes at you to attack, you don't plant your feet and try to block them with brute force. If you do, they will crush you. Instead, you step aside and use their own momentum and weight to throw them. In negotiation jujitsu, you apply the same principle to verbal attacks.
So you don't fight back?
Exactly. When they assert their position forcefully, you do not reject it. When they attack your ideas, you do not defend them. When they attack you personally, you absolutely do not counterattack. You break the vicious cycle of escalation by simply refusing to react. You sidestep their attack and intellectually deflect it against the problem.
The book shares an incredible historical example of this in action. It involves Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and an American lawyer who is trying to quietly mediate the Arab-Israeli conflict. Again, explicitly stating for our listeners, we are strictly looking at the psychology of this interaction, maintaining complete political neutrality.
Right, purely a psychological study.
The American lawyer was meeting with Nasser, who was holding very firm, uncompromising positions regarding Israel and Prime Minister Golda Meir. The lawyer didn't argue with Nasser. He didn't tell Nasser his positions were wrong or unreasonable. He used jujitsu.
What did he do?
He simply asked Nasser, what do you want Golda Meir to actually do? He forced Nasser to articulate a realistic, actionable, political demand for the other side. When forced to actually think through the mechanics of what Golda Meir could politically survive doing in her own country, Nasser suddenly realized his demands were practically impossible for her to meet.
The light bulb went on.
Yes, Nasser burst out laughing, realizing the absurdity of his own unyielding position. By simply asking a probing question and deflecting the force of Nasser's rhetoric, the lawyer opened the door to a massive cognitive breakthrough.
It is a brilliant tactic. When you ask questions instead of making statements, you leave absolutely no target for them to strike. Statements generate resistance, questions generate answers. And when questions fail to break the deadlock, you can utilize something called the one-text procedure. This is typically where a third party steps in to mediate. They don't ask either side for concessions, they ask for interests, and they continually refine a single draft agreement.
It's like the highly relatable story of the husband and wife trying to design a custom house. They're arguing bitterly over every single architectural detail, the size of the bay window, the location of the garage, the type of flooring. It's positional warfare, and it's exhausting.
Anyone who has renovated a house knows this pain.
Exactly. So they bring in an architect. The architect doesn't ask them what positions they hold. He asks why they want what they want. Why do you want the bay window facing east? Is it for morning sun or because you want a view of the garden? The architect takes their underlying interests, goes back to his office, and drafts a single blueprint.
And brings it back to them.
Right, he brings it back and says, "What's wrong with this?" He explicitly asks for criticisms. They give feedback. The kitchen is too small. He takes it back, revises it. He brings back version 2, then version 3, then version 4. Finally, he brings a highly refined draft and says, "This is the best I can do. It incorporates everything we've discussed."
So he simplifies the choice.
Yes. The husband and wife, who were previously overwhelmed by 1,000 tiny decisions, now only have one single decision to make. Yes or no. The one-text procedure cuts through the noise and forces a collaborative evaluation of a single, refined option.
It systematically transforms opponents into partners critiquing a shared document.
Hmm.
Now, let's put all these tools together with what I consider the ultimate masterclass from the book, the story of Frank Turnbull and Jones Realty. This is a deep psychological analysis of how to turn a completely hostile opponent into a collaborative partner using every skill we've discussed.
This is a great story.
Frank Turnbull rented an apartment for $1,200 a month. Sometime later, he discovered the apartment was actually under city rent control, and the legal maximum rent was only $932. He and his roommate had been drastically overcharged by their landlord, Mrs. Jones.
Right. And human nature being what it is, Frank could have stormed into Mrs. Jones's office, slammed his fist on the desk, and screamed, "You robbed me! You're a crook! I'm calling the housing authority and suing you."
Which would have guaranteed a bitter fight.
But he didn't. He used principled negotiation and jujitsu. Let's break down his exact dialogue because it is masterful. He walks into her office, stays calm, and says, "Mrs. Jones, I've just learned, please correct me if I'm wrong, that our apartment's under rent control. We've been told the legal maximum is $932. Have we been misinformed?"
Look at the sheer psychological brilliance of that opening. Please correct me if I'm wrong. He doesn't state it as a hostile, accusatory fact. He presents it as a shared problem to be solved together. He invites her to participate in uncovering the truth. Then, before she can get defensive, he immediately pivots to supporting her as a person.
He builds her up.
He says, "Paul and I understand you were doing a personal favor by renting us this apartment. You were very kind, and we appreciate it." He is actively separating the people from the problem. He is fulfilling her core concern for appreciation, ensuring her ego isn't threatened so she doesn't instinctively raise her shields.
But Mrs. Jones does get defensive anyway. She tries to manipulate him. She claims she's right. She calls him ungrateful. After all she did for him, she basically says, "We had a deal. You agreed to the price. Are you calling me a liar?" And Frank does this incredible jujitsu move. He absolutely refuses to take the emotional bait.
He stays grounded.
He says, "Our concern is fairness. We want to know we didn't pay more than we should have. When we are persuaded that the rent paid measures up fairly to the legal limit, we'll call it even and move out." He anchors the entire conversation to the objective standard of fairness and the law, entirely ignoring her emotional manipulation.
Mrs. Jones, feeling cornered by logic, then tries the ultimate dirty trick. She looks at him and says, "Don't you trust me?" She tries to make it a personal test of loyalty and character. It's a trap. If he says yes, he loses the money. If he says no, he ruins the relationship and starts a fight.
So what does he say?
Frank responds brilliantly. Trust is a separate issue. The issue here is the principle of the rent control laws. He cleanly severs the relationship from the substance. Throughout multiple tense sessions, Frank just keeps asking for the principle behind her actions. What were your reasons for charging $1,200? He continually restates her arguments to prove he's actively listening. Let me see if I understand what you're saying.
And it works.
In the end, he drafts a yesable proposition that allows her to save face and avoid legal trouble. He gets his money back, and astonishingly, she actually ends the negotiation by thanking him and wishing him a nice summer. He used every single tool we've discussed to tame a completely hostile defensive bargainer.
It is a phenomenal case study. Which brings us to our final segment, defeating dirty tricks. Because Mrs. Jones was tough and defensive, but some people out there are actively, maliciously trying to deceive you. They use tricky bargaining tactics, outright lies, psychological abuse, extreme pressure. How do you handle someone who is playing dirty?
When you encounter tricky bargaining, your natural instinct is usually one of two extremes. Either to yield to it because you hate conflict, or to respond in kind, to be deceptive back, to fight fire with fire. Both are strategic mistakes. The rule for taming the hard-duty bargainer is a strict three-step process. Recognize the tactic, explicitly raise the issue, and then negotiate the rules of the game. You don't attack them personally for being a liar, you attack the tactic itself. You bring the implicit trick into the explicit conversation.
Let's break down some specific dirty tricks from the book so listeners can spot them in the wild. First is phony facts and ambiguous authority. You negotiate for hours, they make you think they have the power to close the deal, they squeeze every possible concession out of you, and then right at the end, as you are ready to sign, they say, okay, this looks great. Now I just have to take it to the board of directors for final approval.
It's so frustrating when that happens.
It's a deliberate trap designed to give them a second bite at the apple. To counter this, you explicitly clarify authority beforehand. You ask, do you have the authority to finalize this today? If not, please understand that my offers are entirely tentative until I meet with the actual decision maker.
Another classic manipulation is the good guy, bad guy routine. We see it in police interrogation movies all the time, but it happens in corporate boardrooms and car dealerships too. One negotiator takes a brutal, aggressive, uncompromising stance, the bad guy. Then their partner steps in, looking embarrassed, and offers a slightly less brutal but still terrible compromise, the good guy.
It makes you want to agree with the good guy.
Right. It's pure psychological manipulation designed to make you feel grateful for a terrible deal because it's better than the bad guy's deal. If you recognize it, you simply smile at the good guy and say, I appreciate your effort to be reasonable, but I still need to know the objective principle behind your offer. You flatly refuse to play their emotional game.
The most dramatic trick discussed is what the book calls lock-in tactics. It's based on the game theorist Thomas Schelling's famous analogy of the two dynamite trucks speeding toward each other on a single-lane road. It's a high-stakes game of chicken. Who is going to swerve first? As the trucks get closer and closer, one driver, in full view of the other, rips his own steering wheel off the steering column and throws it out the window.
He physically locks himself in.
Exactly. He cannot swerve. He has shifted 100% of the responsibility to avoid the deadly crash onto the other driver. In real-world negotiations, this looks like a politician publicly vowing to the media that they will never accept a tax increase, or a union leader promising their members they will strike if a specific number isn't met. They lock themselves in to force the other side to yield.
So how do you defeat that?
To defeat a lock-in tactic, you must ignore the commitment. You reframe it. I see you told the press you won't accept the tax increase. We all have our aspirations and public statements. Now let's put that aside and talk about the objective merits of the budget shortfall. You do not take the steering wheel out the window seriously. You treat it as an irrelevant distraction.
As we look at all these sophisticated strategies, it naturally raises an important question from the FAQs at the back of this book. Does traditional positional bargaining ever make sense? The short answer is, rarely. It might make sense if the stakes are incredibly low, like buying a cheap trinket at a tourist flea market, and you have absolutely no ongoing relationship with the person, and you don't really care about the outcome. But for anything complex, or anything involving a long-term professional or personal relationship, principled negotiation is vastly superior.
But what about negotiating with someone completely unsavory or totally irrational? Should you even bother sitting down at the table?
The book uses a fascinating example of a major bank negotiating with a bankrupt energy company. The bank offered a very fair, generous deal to take 51% of the stock and reduce the loan interest. The energy company stonewalled. They refused to even talk or counteroffer. The bank executives thought the company leadership was being totally irrational.
But they weren't.
No, they weren't. The energy company's BDNA was simply waiting for global oil prices to rise, which would mathematically solve all their debt problems without having to give the bank control. The bank was negotiating with the wrong entity. They needed to pivot and negotiate with the judge overseeing the bankruptcy, appealing to the judge's interest in settling the case quickly. You have to think clearly about your BDNA and, crucially, their BDNA before you decide if negotiating even makes logical sense. Sometimes, the best move is not to play until the board changes.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from the psychological necessity of separating the people from the problem to focusing intensely on underlying interests rather than surface positions, inventing creative options for mutual gain, insisting on objective criteria to avoid battles of will, developing your walkaway BDNA, and using psychological jujitsu against dirty tricks.
To leave you with a final provocative thought, I want to share a story about how we fundamentally define winning. In the 1960s, an American father and his 12-year-old son were in Hyde Park in London, throwing a frisbee back and forth. Now, frisbees were practically unknown in England at the time. A small, curious crowd gathered to watch this strange plastic disc floating through the air.
They had no idea what it was.
None. Finally, a British gentleman walked over to the father, tipped his hat, and said, "Sorry to bother you. Been watching you a quarter of an hour. Who's winning?" What's fascinating here is that the gentleman completely misunderstood the fundamental nature of the game. Frisbee isn't about winning. It's not a zero-sum competition. It's about the joyous, collaborative process of keeping the disc in the air together. Asking who is winning a negotiation is exactly like asking who is winning a marriage. If you are asking that question, you've already lost the more important game. The true victory in any negotiation is not crushing the other side or extracting the maximum penalty. It is building a better, more efficient, more amicable process for dealing with your inevitable ongoing differences.
That is profound, and it completely shifts the paradigm from combat to collaboration. And I want to challenge you, the listener, directly. Don't just let this be interesting theory that you listen to on a commute. Take one conflict or negotiation you are facing this week with your boss, your spouse, a contractor, a neighbor. When they come at you, don't state your position, stop, take a breath, and ask why. Search for their underlying interests. Separate the person from the problem. Let these ideas actively enhance your life starting today.
We truly want you to participate actively in this material. Sit down tonight with a piece and paper and think critically about your own BATNA in your current job or your most pressing business deal. What is your actual walk-away alternative? How can you invest time to strengthen it today? If you take the time to build your BATNA, your confidence at the table will absolutely soar.
To fully master these concepts, we highly recommend you purchase this book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, by William L. Ury and Roger Fisher. It is literally a manual for navigating human life and conflict.
And once you start applying these tools, the results can be truly startling. You will start seeing the matrix of human interaction everywhere you look.
We deeply encourage you to engage with the author's work on social media and share how these principled negotiation strategies have worked in your own life. It is incredible to see these theories play out in the real world. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the podcast. Please invite your friends to follow, subscribe, and share the Playing Books podcast with colleagues, family members, and anyone who could use a little more yes in their life.